Does the soul exist without the body? Is the soul immortal? When a living dies, does its soul die too? Is the soul a fiction? The video series on the soul introduce some results of my journey to find out the truth regarding the above 4 questions. The contents of the video series include Western philosophy and Christianity, Eastern philosophy, and other religions such as Buddhism, and more. This video introduces the third part of the video series. The title of the third part is Critique on the Immortality of the Soul in the History of Western Philosophy.
British philosopher Bertrand Russell, who lived from 1870 to 1970, argued in his book titled The History of Western Philosophy, as follows. The distinction between mind and matter, which has become a commonplace in philosophy, and science, and popular thought, has a religious origin, and began as the distinction of soul and body. Russell says, the Orphic, as we saw, proclaims himself the child of earth, and of the starry heaven. From earth comes the body, from heaven the soul. It is this theory that Plato seeks to express in the language of philosophy. Orphism is an esoteric religion of the ancient Greek world. It is said that between the 8th and 5th centuries BC, priests preaching the teachings of Orpheus traveled all over Greece. Orpheus' doctrine is that the body comes from the earth, and the soul comes from heaven. It is said that Orpheus emphasized rewards and punishments after death, and taught that the human soul is liberated after receiving these rewards and punishments. Russell says, to return to the Phaedo Sebes expresses doubt as to the survival of the soul after death, and urges Socrates to offer arguments. This he proceeds to do, but it must be said that the arguments are very poor. The first argument is that all things which have opposites are generated from their opposites, a statement which reminds us of Anaximander's views on cosmic justice. Now life and death are opposites, and therefore each must generate the other. It follows that the souls of the dead exist somewhere, and come back to earth in due course. St. Paul's statement, the seed is not quickened except it die, seems to belong to some such theory as this. The second argument is that knowledge is recollection, and therefore the soul must have existed before birth. The theory that knowledge is recollection is supported chiefly by the fact that we have ideas, such as exact equality, which cannot be derived from experience. We have experience of approximate equality, but absolute equality is never found among sensible objects, and yet we know what we mean by absolute equality. Since we have not learnt this from experience, we must have brought the knowledge with us from a previous existence. A similar argument, he says, applies to all other ideas. Thus the existence of essences, and our capacity to apprehend them, proves the pre-existence of the soul with knowledge. doctrine of reminiscence being considered established, Siebes says about half of what was required has been proven, to wit, that our souls existed before we were born, that the soul will exist after death, as well as before birth, is the other half of which the proof is still wanting. Socrates accordingly applies himself to this. He says that it follows from what was said about everything being generated from its opposite, according to which death must generate life, just as much as life generates death. Of all the men of his time, Phaedo concludes, Socrates was the wisest and justest and best. Nevertheless, Bertrand Russell evaluated Socrates in the history of Western philosophy as follows. The Platonic Socrates was a pattern to subsequent philosophers for many ages. What are we to think of him ethically? I am concerned only with the man as Plato portrays him. His merits are obvious. He is indifferent to worldly success, so devoid of fear that he remains calm and urbane, and humorous to the last moment, caring more for what he believes to be truth than for anything else whatever. He has, however, some very grave defects. He is dishonest and sophistical in argument, and in his private thinking he uses intellect to prove conclusions that are to him agreeable, rather than in a disinterested search for knowledge. There is something smug and unctuous about him, which reminds one of a bad type of cleric. His courage in the face of death would have been more remarkable if he had not believed that he was going to enjoy eternal bliss in the company of the gods. Unlike some of his predecessors, he was not scientific in his thinking, but was determined to prove the universe agreeable to his ethical standards. This is treachery to truth, and the worst of philosophic sins. As a man, we may believe him admitted to the communion of saints, but, as a philosopher he needs a long residence in a scientific purgatory. Russell says, at last, Socrates describes the fate of souls. After death the good to heaven, the bad to hell, the intermediate to purgatory. Russell says that Socrates taught the soul of the true philosopher, which has, in life, been liberated from thraldom to the flesh, will, after death, depart to the invisible world, to live in bliss in the company of the gods. Depending on each soul's nature, a soul defiled by pursuing the desires of the flesh will become a ghost wandering around the graveyard, or a soul defiled by binge drinking, or gluttony will enter the body of a stubborn animal like a donkey, or the souls of those who preferred injustice and robbery will enter the flesh of animals such as wolves, hawks, and kites. A person who is not a philosopher, but possesses the virtues of an ordinary citizen, will either live in some gentle and social kind, such as bees or ants, or return to the human race, and become a gentle person.
Book of Truth says the truth about the soul. These video series do not explain the content of the truth about the soul in Book of Truth. Book of Truth is written in English by Roy, and published by Great Time. If you select the books section in the US Amazon website, and type Book of Truth Roy, you will find Book of Truth, its introduction, and its book review sites. The third part of the 6-part Soul video series ends here.